In 2018, Americans imported fewer than 2,000 Japanese mini-trucks. 5 years later, that number had more than tripled, and the trucks were not going to collectors in Los Angeles or New York. They were going to working farms in the hills of Tennessee, ranch land across the Pacific Northwest, and back roads outside Raleigh, North Carolina, where one farmer paid $2,000 for a 30-year-old Honda Acti and called it the most useful vehicle he had ever owned. There are tens of thousands of these trucks scattered across rural America now, parked beside barns and feed stores, doing the exact work a $60,000 American pickup was supposedly built for. They were never sold new here. They cannot legally touch an interstate. And in more than a dozen states, owning one is now a borderline legal gamble. So the question was never whether rural America is buying them. It clearly is. The question is what drove an entire stretch of the country to go looking overseas for a truck in the first place. To understand that, you have to drop the word trend, because a trend is something people pick up for fun. This is something people chose out of necessity after running the math 3 times and not liking the answer. The Honda Acti, the Suzuki Carry, and the Daihatsu Hijet were never designed to compete with Detroit. They were built in the 1980s and the 1990s for Japanese farmers working plots narrower than an American driveway. Nobody in Dearborn paid them the slightest attention. They were small, slow, and irrelevant. Then sometime around 2021, they stopped being irrelevant because the American pickup had quietly priced its own customers out of the market, and a 30-year-old import from another continent had become the rational choice. That is the real story here. Not a quirky little truck, a verdict. And the most revealing part of this story is what happened when somebody in a government office decided that verdict was unacceptable. Start with the number that started everything, which is the price. A used K truck lands on American soil for somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000, depending on mileage, condition, and whether it has 4-wheel drive. The average new full-size pickup now sells for well over $50,000, and a loaded crew cab clears $80,000. For the cost of a single new F-150, a farmer can buy 7 K trucks, park 6 of them, and still have fuel money left over. But the purchase price is only the opening argument. A K truck runs a 3-cylinder engine displacing 660 cubic centimeters, smaller than some motorcycles, and returns 40 to 50 miles per gallon. A modern full-size pickup averages somewhere between 18 and 22 miles per gallon. On an operation where you drive between barns, fields, and feedlots every single day, that gap is not a rounding error. It is thousands of dollars a year, every year. Then there is the truck itself. A K truck is under 5 feet wide and roughly 11 feet long, which means it fits through a barn door, between 2 fence lines, and down an orchard row a full-size pickup cannot enter without taking out a tree. The bed sits low to the ground, the side panels fold completely flat, and the engine tucks under the cab, so a truck shorter than a Honda Civic carries a bed nearly the length of a full-size pickup's. The 4-wheel drive versions climb mud and snow on a vehicle that weighs about 1,500 pounds, and because the engine has no turbochargers, no direct injection, and no emissions plumbing, a farmer with a basic socket set can change the oil, swap the brakes, and replace a starter in his own barn on a Saturday. A home remodeling contractor swapped his pickup for a 1994 Subaru Sambar and told reporters it did everything his mid-sized truck had. A San Antonio brewery runs a 1997 Suzuki Carry for keg deliveries. A soap maker in Philadelphia works farmers markets out of one because it fits a standard vendor stall. These are not hobbyists chasing a novelty. They are working people who picked up a calculator, noticed the foreign tool cost 1/10 of the domestic one, and did the job better, and acted on it. The American truck did not lose this fight on horsepower. It lost it on arithmetic. So how did the American pickup, the most profitable vehicle Detroit builds, become the wrong tool for the people who practically invented the word truck? It happened the way these things always happen, slowly and in one specific direction. Over the last 2 decades, the full-size pickup grew taller, wider, and heavier almost every model year. Bed rails climbed so high that loading cargo now requires a built-in step, an accessory that itself adds hundreds of dollars to the sticker. Every inch of that growth was sold as progress because a bigger truck supports a bigger price, and a bigger price supports a better quarter. Underneath the sheet metal, the engineering went the same way. Ford's 3.5-liter EcoBoost runs twin turbochargers at cylinder pressures that would have destroyed a motor 20 years ago. General Motors' 6.2-liter V8 runs, bearing clearances tighter than a human hair on thin synthetic oil. These engines produce remarkable power and remarkable fuel numbers, and they do it with the entire margin for error engineered out. One contaminated oil passage, one brief drop in pressure, one bearing a fraction out of spec, and the engine does not limp. It detonates. This is not a hypothetical. In April of 2025, General Motors recalled more than 721,000 trucks and SUVs over that exact 6.2-liter V8. After its own investigation logged more than 28,000 reports of engine failure, roughly half of them happening while the vehicle was moving. The cause traced back to defective connecting rods and crankshafts. And the remedy for any truck that passed inspection was thicker oil, a new oil cap, and a fresh insert for the owner's manual. Detroit's answer to a $60,000 engine eating itself was a heavier grade of oil and a sticker. By January of 2026, federal regulators had reopened the case because the fix was not fixing it. A K-truck engine from 1995 was built with loose tolerances, conventional oil, and the assumption that the man who owned it would also be the man who repaired it. It was engineered to forgive. The modern American truck engine was engineered to its absolute limit and then sold with a warranty instead of a margin. One of those philosophies keeps a farm running. The other keeps a dealership's service bay full. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribing is the one thing that tells the algorithm to keep them coming. Here is where the story stops being about engineering and becomes about a single piece of paper. By 2021, the K-truck had a problem that had nothing to do with the K-truck. It was working too well. Importers could not keep them in stock. Specialty dealers were opening across the country, and rural Americans were quietly walking away from the new truck lot. Then, in June of 2021, an organization most Americans have never heard of published a document that would change which trucks those Americans were legally allowed to drive. The organization is called the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. It is not a government agency. It is a nonprofit, effectively a trade group for the people who run state DMV offices. That June, it circulated a document titled, "In the Flat Language of Bureaucracy, a Best Practice for the Registration and Titling of Mini Trucks." The recommendation inside was simple. States should stop registering these vehicles for road use. It leaned on a definition of an off-road vehicle broader than the federal government's own, and it specifically named K-trucks 25 years and older, the exact trucks federal import law had already declared legal. And in a detail that should stop anyone reading it cold, the document acknowledged its recommendations might conflict with existing state law. Its suggested solution was not to soften the recommendation. It was for states to change their laws until the recommendation became legal. That is precisely what happened. In the summer of 2021, Maine's Motor Vehicle Bureau began mailing letters to people who already owned these trucks, telling them the vehicles they had legally registered were now reclassified as off-road only. Rhode Island went further and revoked registrations it had already granted, ordering owners to surrender plates they had done nothing wrong to earn. New York, Georgia, and Pennsylvania followed. Then Massachusetts, Michigan, and Colorado. State after state, the same reversal, citing the same safety language, tracing back to the same document. And when reporters examined who had actually authored that 2021 best practice, the answer was its own kind of confession. It had been written in the majority by motor vehicle officials from states that went on to ban or restrict the trucks. The people who wrote the recommendation were the people who enforced it. The official justification was always safety, and it is true that a 1,500-pound truck offers little protection against a 4,500-pound one. But safety does not explain the timing, and it does not explain the targeting. The federal government had already drawn the safety line. It is called the 25-year rule, and these trucks were on the legal side of it. A nonprofit redrew that line in a memo, and a dozen states picked up the pen. So ask the question every investigation eventually has to ask. Who benefits when the cheap option disappears? It is not the farmer in Tennessee who now owns a paid-for truck he cannot register. It is not the contractor whose plates were pulled through no fault of his own. The only party that gains when a $5,000 truck becomes illegal is the company still trying to sell a $60,000 one. There is no direct evidence that an automaker dictated that 2021 document, and it would be irresponsible to claim there is. But you do not need a conspiracy when you have an incentive. Detroit has spent decades unable or unwilling to build a small, cheap, simple work truck because there is no fat margin in simplicity. The K-truck exposed that gap completely. And a competitor you cannot beat on price, on fuel economy, or on repairability is a competitor you have every reason to want regulated out of existence. You do not have to out-engineer the better truck. You only have to make the better truck illegal. Notice too that this is one of the rare threats that can be killed this way. A company cannot legislate away a rival's better factory, but a 30-year-old import with no domestic lobby, no dealer network, and no marketing budget has no one in the room when the motor vehicle administrators sit down to write their best practices. The K-truck never lost an argument. It simply never got invited to have one. And that is the part of the story worth carrying out of it, because it is not really about Japanese trucks at all. It is about what happens to a market when the people inside it stop competing and start gatekeeping. For most of the last century, the American promise was that the better product would win, that if you built something cheaper, tougher, and more honest, the customer would find you. The K-truck did all three. It got found. And the response was not a better American truck. The response was a memo. When a product can no longer win on price, on durability, or on trust, there is always one move left. Not to improve the product. Instead, to narrow the customer's choices until the inferior option is the only one still standing. Rural America noticed the better tool. The open question is whether they will be allowed to keep it. If you have driven both, a modern full-size pickup and one of these mini trucks, I genuinely want to hear which one you would put your own money on and why. Leave it in the comments because that debate is more honest than anything in that 2021 document. And if this is the kind of investigation you want this channel to keep doing, a like and a subscribe is a quiet, low-pressure way to make sure it can. Stay skeptical out there.